Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv, and this time I'm speaking to Martin Franklin, all the way from Australia, about the superb cassette culture. Hey Martin, thanks for speaking today.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you very much. This show got so many memories coming to me of being in the music at the time and being in bands and the whole scene that was going on around the time. So what's your history with this independent music scene?
There's an interesting story about the sort of genesis of this podcast. And it does span that whole 35-year odd period. So back in the late 80s, I was doing various music-related projects, including running a small cassette label.
Yeah.
And at that time, which is the topic we talk about in the podcast, is I was doing lots of stuff through the mail, writing letters to people, swapping cassettes, and building a kind of network. I didn't know that's what it was at the time, but exchanging music with sort of like-minded people. And my cassette label, I didn't do it for that long, but I made a few releases and a couple of compilation albums from this sort of tape swapping network. And then what happened at the end of 2023 is somebody got in touch with me out of the blue, which was Tom Gibbs, who runs Infinite Expanse, which is a modern day cassette label that sort of unearths rarities from the pre-internet era. And he said, "Oh, what about reissuing one of these compilation albums?" And so that sort of process led me into contacting a lot of the artists that I hadn't heard of or hadn't spoken to for 30 years. And when I did, I just got so wrapped up in the stories and that sort of all the memories of what we did back in that time. And I really felt I wanted to do an oral history project, really, that gathers all these stories of what happened back in those times. And it's so vulnerable being in a pre-internet era, because a lot of this stuff is not as well documented as other things. So so that was the kind of my background that sort of led me into doing the podcast now.
Yeah, because it created a talking point at home between me and my other half, because we're talking about it. Nowhere near that sort of level, but I did, we called it Smelly Dog, or we called it Smelly Dog Records or something. So it was just really cheaply made tapes that we did, and we put artists from around this area, from Mansfield and the Nottinghamshire area. Then as well, and then we had Servo Records in this area as well, and so it brought that to mind, brought in the bands that I was a member of as well, like a previous incarnation of Shadow Play and all these groups and things. And then, like I said in the post as well, I had a friend of mine, Wiggy from Matlock, who used to he introduced me to the Osricks through tape cassettes that he'd got of Osric Tentacles, which led me to Eat Static. And then you get to the Attrition, which jumped out at me, and then Porcupine Tree. I mean, it'd be cool if you could get Stephen Wilson, or you could get the Osric guys, or Joey Hinton or somebody as a guest at some point. That'd be quite cool to get that side of things at some point, if possible. But it just brought all these memories flooding back from that exciting time.
It was a really exciting time, and a lot of the people that I've talked to have sort of commented on Those overseas tape exchanges being so amazing, getting a letter from someone in Japan or these sort of far-flung countries. But also, one of the things that's really appealing to me about it now is, as you were saying, it was like that sort of DIY spirit of you could make it about your own scene and make it about where you live. You mentioned attrition. Suddenly they're all talking about what's happening in Coventry and doing fanzines about bands in Coventry and who's playing where. There was something about that thing of just do it. I always think it sort of springboards off of the punk. Here's 3 chords, now form a band. Here's a cassette tape and a Porter studio. Go and be a label. Yeah.
My Porter studio is smack bang behind the laptop, by the way.
Oh, okay.
The microphone goes through it.
Amazing. That's like a lot of things. I'm sort of sad that I actually got rid of mine now because it was still working absolutely fine. I just bought that idea that new technology must be better. But actually, I did a lot. I recorded albums on mine and all sorts of things. But yeah, that sort of act locally idea, and certainly in the earlier incarnations of that cassette network, there was really almost like a sort of anti-commercial viewpoint. People were definitely, they wanted it to be authentic exchanges between the artists. So if you wanted somebody's album, they'd copy it for you. They'd run one off for you. They didn't have a lot of stock hanging around because in those days, a lot of us were young and pretty poor, actually. So we didn't have lots of money, but we had a lot of time. And that's what sort of fired it all up, I think.
Yeah, the amount of times that this Technics next to me here was running and I'd have a tape in one and it'd be copying that original onto another tape so that I could give it out to people with bands from this area as well, all put together. So you'd have DLs and all these other groups where you'd, like you said, you'd make compilations and hand them out. And that's the sort of thing I used to do sometimes when I was arranging gigs, because I started this thing up where I created links between, because it used to be strange back in the day where venues didn't have anything to do with each other, different pubs, because they were like competition to each other, or they saw each other that way. But I started this sort of like network where, through what I called the gig list, I got a list of all the local gigs that were going on in all the different pubs, and listed them out week by week. So in the Mansfield, East Midlands, so Mansfield, Sutton, Nashfield, and that sort of area there. So I put those together in the list, and that led to me arranging gigs where the idea was that I'd have 2 bands from one area, from a same area, and they'd be supported by groups from other areas as well, two other bands from a different area each. So what I'd do is I'd make a mixtape up of songs by all 4 of those groups that then could be at the gigs or given to the actual venue, the owner or the landlord, and they'd have something to listen to, so they know what's happening at this gig that I've arranged. And so you'd have it where you'd have that in one pub in this local area, say Mansfield, and then Leicester, you'd have 2 Leicester bands with a Mansfield band and one of the other bands from another area that I've been organising gigs. So these cassettes were always running constantly and recording, and it's a cool period to do that.
That's a genius idea of sort of mixing up different acts from different regions and then making that little network. How long did you run that for?
That ran for about 4 years, I think, all told. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but not a small amount of work, I imagine.
No. And like you said, you don't really get anything for it either. It was just the fun of being able to organise that, and occasionally I'd be naughty and put my own band at the time in there as well, you see.
I think in a lot of cases that's an underlying motivation, that you can always add a bit of your own stuff in and get it out there as well. But yeah, that sort of hand-to-hand copying mechanism, I think everyone did that until they reached a certain watershed moment. In one of my episodes, I interviewed Alan Ryder, who did the Adventures in Reality fanzine and label. and he talked about getting an initial run of 50 copies of an album he'd released, and doing them one by one dubbing them from one cassette to the other. And then the other thing that sprung to mind when you were talking about your gig network was what Rough Trade did with music distribution, that they put together the Cartel, which was this sort of group of a lot of regional music distributors, and they had sort of, it's almost like that idea was in the air of let's band together and increase our power by doing so. So Rough Trade got Red Rhino, who did one area, the Backs, who did another area, and then said, oh, why don't we all distribute each other's stuff? And suddenly we've got national distribution rather than regional distribution. So, yeah, it was a super powerful idea, but I think navigating the business end of it is not as easy as it sounds.
Yeah, it makes you think in a way, what would we have done if we'd have had the internet back then?
Yeah, I sort of feel one of the things which people have talked to me about, it's all about knowing that when somebody exchanged something with you, that it was personal, and they were probably making that copy of the cassette for you, or even if it was something that was already duplicated, there'd be some flyers in there, and there'd be a little note in there, and it was personalized. And I feel like because it was so much harder, it wasn't just, dash off an email quickly. You had to spend time sitting down, writing a letter, or taking it to the post office and doing all that kind of stuff. It sort of had a value and a significance to people, which I feel like now on the internet, because it's made wide communication sort of easier, people are, I don't know, although there are valuable personal connections that get made, somehow they're not as sort of charged, or I don't know, there was a real value that people felt in the effort that you had to make to communicate in the pre-internet times. So yeah, I don't feel like Bandcamp or anything like that has become an immediate replacement for what happened in the cassette network era.
Yeah, there's certain personal links that you'd have with people, for instance, where I would be physically going to these venues or these pubs, these clubs all over, jumping on two buses in some cases, two trains in some cases to get to Leicester, to meet somebody in Leicester, to be able to make an arrangement or agreement on something, on a gig, go and visit their actual venue by using two trains, then coming all the way back, and then going to see somebody else somewhere else. So there was that actual spirit of traveling between places and making these real connections. I mean, I'm still best friends with the owner, or the previous owner, of a pub called the Frog and Nightgown in Worksop, and then in Mansfield, some venue people that owned venues back then. In Leicester, I'm still friends with people from Leicester. I mean, for crying out loud, one of my best friends actually took over Paul Eaton's role in The Beautiful South.
Oh, is that
And
right?
he's from Leicester, so all these
Yeah,
connections that I made, I wouldn't have made if I'd have not jumped on these trains, these buses, and met these people in person. I
yeah.
wouldn't have that closer connection with them if it was a quick, here's an email, or I'll chat to you on a chat line or something online.
Yeah, 100%. It's definitely something that I've heard pretty consistently with all the people I've talked to in the cassette network, whether they were labels or missions or whatever. That that fact that they're still in touch with people 40 years later that they
Yeah.
met through that network. So yeah, it's definitely something to be said about the effort that it took to get hold of people. And I guess because things were on such a smaller scale there, you didn't have large interest groups or websites dedicated to a particular thing. So
Yep.
when you did meet someone who was into the things that you were into, or you could sort of share a common aim, it definitely resonated powerfully, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So what? I think we've sort of touched on this in a way. The importance of fanzines and these gig guides. To
Yeah.
me, the importance is getting it out there and giving people something to be interested in and to create that sort of fervor for the industry.
Yeah, I think in all cases we've definitely spoken to a few fanzine publishers f from that sort of 80s and 90s era. In actual fact, I've got a future episode coming up talking to someone who's got quite a young fanzine that they're starting now. But certainly back then, the feature, which is, I guess is perhaps not so present in our culture now, is people would print addresses and or phone numbers in some cases in the fanzine. So
Yeah,
if you saw a review of a band, you'd actually have their address and you'd write to them and send you a little postal order of money, or in some cases phone them up.
yeah,
So fanzines were like these kind of massive directories of information where I feel like the scene or the audience could sort of see itself and recognize itself. And yeah, one of the I'll tell you a little kind of, it's not a secret, but it's
yeah,
what's coming up in my next season is I've had a few correspondents write to me and talk about an earlier stage of the UK cassette scene, which for people into experimental music,
yeah,
it 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 came out of a fanzine called Industrial News, which was produced by the group Throbbing Gristle,
yeah,
and they had a very sort of open approach to what they were publishing in Industrial News, and so they had a section in each issue of the fanzine which was tapes received, it was called. So they would list who had sent them cassettes. No sort of review or anything. It was just like, here's a list of people who sent us cassettes. And so that tapes received list was the first time people were actually seeing names of people and along with their addresses. So a lot of people started getting in touch with each other through that. For that simple motivation, they knew, here's someone who's into what I'm into. Let's get in touch and say hi. So yeah, that's a sort of powerful driver. We're going to look into some of the real sort of like late 70s cassette labels or bands who started the sort of scene them from seeing names in the tapes received list.
Throbbing Gristle, you've got, if I'm remembering rightly, you've got a couple of people who were like outliers from, not outliers, but they were sort of like, so you had, that was an important era for groups sort of like Hawkwind and that sort of space rock, and the transition then
Mm,
from the late 70s to the 80s.
mm,
And a couple of the members of Hawkwind, I believe, did some stuff that was experimental outside of Hawkwind that I think
mm.
went through Throbbing Gristle, as far
Oh,
as I
is that right?
remember, which is also fascinating because there with that you've got a group that were always on the edge. They were on that sort of like line between the
Yeah,
experimental independent and the signed sort of like act. So
yeah,
they were always on
yeah,
that sort of level.
yeah.
So it sort of makes sense that they would then have these experimental side projects, shall we
Mm,
say?
yeah, in one of our episodes, one of the artists talked about an event that took place in Milton Keynes in 1983 called the UK Electronica Festival,
Yeah,
where a few of the sort of younger emerging electronic artists were playing, and they'd all sort of gone to this event and met for the first time. But on the bill of the festival, which was only, it was in a sports hall in Milton Keynes, they had Chris and Cozy playing, who were two members of the recently, I guess a few, they've been split from Throbbing Gristle for a few years then, but they were playing as were Hawkwind.
yeah,
So Hawkwind did sort of have this kind of presence in that sort of DIY, as you say, the kind of outlier kind of worlds, because they've always been a bit of a self-contained unit in what
yeah.
they did.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it sounds unlikely, but actually, I think philosophically they probably had quite a good kinship with some of the punk and DIY artists.
But you'd find that carrying on then into something like, I mean, one of my favourites, Osric Tentacles, they've
Yeah.
also got that sort of level of the on the border of the two different worlds as well. Because you've got the officially released albums through labels, bigger labels or whatever, or distributed by these bigger labels anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
you've also got their experimental little cassette things. Oh God, some great music on those old cassettes of theirs if you can get hold of them, which is doubtful. I doubt you'll get hold of any of those, but if you can, I think if people are listening, get hold of them because they are absolute gold in comparison to what's been released.
Yeah, I feel like those early Osric tapes. I used to have them. I don't know what's become of them, but I don't have them now. But they sort of seemed like to me to have emerged sort of fully formed. They
Yeah.
had their sort of identity and superb musicianship in their release as well, and they just sort of emerged, just like they were just there straight away, doing their thing and fully developed. So yeah, we as we did an episode, the last episode of this first season, talking to Richard Allen from Freakbeat and Delirium
Yeah.
and Michael Dog from Club Dog, and without either of them sort of prompting each other, they sort of came up with this story of the Osric Tentacles emerging using the same DIY cassette distribution system. So they just used to get their cassettes absolutely anywhere and grew from there. And that they would just play absolutely anywhere. I used to work in a venue in Windsor back in the late 80s, and I booked Osric Tentacles I think twice to play there, and once in a sort of small basement space, and then 6 months later they got so much bigger we booked them for the main hall and they sold that out as well. But yeah, so they were using the sort of DIY kind of ethos to do their thing, even though it's sort of musically a little bit of a sidestep. But yeah, there's some good stories from Michael Dog from Club Dog, who booked them early on and had who you might be thinking of, Nodens Ictus, which was like the Osric's kind of ambient version, where they sort of did the synths and sequencer kind of stuff with a little bit of a sort of Euro synth
Yeah.
flavor to it. And he released a small series of cassettes live at Club Dog, of which that was one of them. So it's on my wish list now to try and track that down.
That would project there that you're on about, that would eventually lead to Joey creating the offshoot that would be Eat Static, which is very much down that sort of
I
lane.
guess, yeah, I guess it would have done, yeah. Thinking, what can we do if we get rid of the guitars and just sort of go electronic?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then you'd have was it Rowley that also left with him, or was it Merv? I can't remember.
Merv was, yeah, it was Merv and Joey formed Eat Static
That's it.
back in those days, yeah.
So instead, Merv would instead of doing the drums, he'd go into more of the drum machines or the programming and replace the reel with that. And like you said, they go fully electronic, but in an experimental way,
Mm,
not like a dance culture way, but or whatever. And the coolest thing about these bands, I mean, you'd have it with Porcupine Tree in the early days as well, in the Delirium days, was that
mm,
you sort of never knew what to expect with a lot of these acts as well when they were coming to gigs. You'd listen to the cassette, but there's almost I'm going to get sworn at here probably. There's almost a jazz mentality in a sense where all these tunes that these artists had, there was a vibe to them,
mm,
but that vibe, everything around it changed depending on which gig you go to. You go to see them one night and the songs
mm,
would sound this way. You get to see them the next night and they wouldn't sound the same. You'd have the same underlying basic beat or vibe going behind it, and
mm.
everybody else would just do what they feel like around it.
Yeah, I ended up actually editing a lot of the stories of Porcupine Tree out of the interview that I did with Richard. But he talked about Stephen Wilson originally recorded a lot of that early Porcupine Tree stuff was just him and a Porter studio doing it. So sort of before there was a band as such, he suddenly started to get some success and invitations to play gigs, and had to find a band to put together. So that might explain why it was slightly fluid at the beginning, because he's translating what was a solo project into a band project. Yeah.
So going from there then, you've sort of explained as well how you've gone from this independent music to creating a podcast around it. Actually, so how were you introduced then to podcast in the first place? What introduced you to it? And then what made you then decide I can do this myself and then do a podcast?
I'm sort of long in the tooth in terms of podcasting. So I started to do a podcast in 2006, which I think was in that sort of first sort of flush of people identifying this as a thing that you could do and have it published through iTunes as it was then. I used to run like a digital arts department in an arts venue, so we'd have a lot of visiting artists coming in, and sometimes they'd do talks, or I would just grab them for an interview. And it was that sort of idea of let's document our community. And I published, it was called the Gene Pool podcast, and I did probably 150 episodes of that from 2006 for a couple of years, and then I made a connection with a local radio station, community radio station, which was Sound Art Radio down in Totnes.
Yeah.
And just sort of said to them, I've got this kind of half-hour audio show. Could we collaborate and maybe put it on the radio? Which we did. So it became a radio show from the original sort of podcast sources for a spell. And then when I sort of changed careers and went to work for other organizations, I always kept this idea of, because I worked in the arts and culture industry, I always sort of carried this idea of why isn't a theatre like a kind of broadcasting center? Because you've got the content and you've got all the talented artists and you've got all the sort of performance infrastructure of lighting and sound and all of that stuff. Why aren't you streaming this and producing more programs out of it? I was a bit of a lone voice with my vision. A lot of the venues didn't really see what I was talking about, but I then did podcasts for a couple of other venues and took over a podcast for London Philharmonic Orchestra, which was my sort of last employer. So that's my sort of podcasting journey. And now I run a podcast production company. That's my micro business here, sort of helping other people get their podcasts made.
But there's certain aesthetic to the world of podcasting that lends itself nicely to the same spirit that we had back then, which is this go out there and do it DIY to a certain degree. I mean, everything's going online, but it's sort of like just like we are. We've got our headphones, we've got the microphone there, we've got the equipment, and just doing it. There's that freedom there, in a sense.
Oh, 100%.
Itself.
Yeah, I sort of, in a way, miss that spirit that was definitely there in the early days of podcasting, because it was there's no sort of formality around it, and the big broadcasters weren't involved in podcasting at all. So you had all of these kind of techno weirdos who are suddenly like, let's talk about the stuff that we're into and put it out on the internet. So I know you want to talk a little bit later on about my podcast listening, and back then I got really interested in the 2600 podcast, who are a group of sort of New York hackers who had a weekly podcast and radio show in New York, and they had all sorts of stories about not necessarily sort of computer hacking, but a few things like that. But there was like a small group of them where they're still going, and they just had this sort of flow in the conversation, and you it sort of felt like, oh, you're the fly on the wall, just hearing these guys talk about stuff, and it's really charming. So yeah, that definitely was one of the things that captured a bit of that spirit for me. But yeah, I think it is a little bit under a wave of change now with the top. You look at the top 100 podcasts, and it's all done by major broadcasters. So it's a very different type of industry now to what it was then.
Yeah, just to pull away for a second, I listened to an episode of my friend Joe Wisby. He does a show called Beatles Books about authors who write books about the Beatles, because a lot of books about the Beatles. And he recently did an episode where he was talking with Stuart McConey, radio presenter and author, works for the Beeb. And I was saying to Joe in a private chat with him that I'd listened to that episode, and there's a certain point in that episode where it suddenly becomes like a conversation between two like minds that are just, I said, it's more like two friends chatting than a formal modern podcast that's big production or whatever. And I said to him, that was my favourite bit, is where suddenly it just became these two just chatting, conversation, and it became real to me. It reminded me of conversations back in the day with the underground, to a degree, where you were all friends and you get lost in the conversation, and it felt natural. It wasn't forced in any way at all.
That still is a sort of magic that podcasting has, where I think people are always, from my point of view, of sort of coming from the performing arts industry, I've always been aware that people are fascinated by backstage and what happens behind the curtain. How do you prepare, and how do you get the thing that you're actually presenting? And I think that's what podcasting does. It doesn't have to be a slick radio show. And so sort of leaning into that authenticity of it's just us chatting about things we're enthusiastic about. There's really something special about that, not being beholden to a particular format or duration. You can just go, you can sort of follow the conversation wherever you want to go with it, really.
Yeah, it gives me some difficult moments with people in the podcasting industry. But when I've discussed this, because I've said to them before that it worries me with the changes that are happening in podcasting, because my favourite thing about podcast is that it's always, up until recently, been about those niches and those little areas where normal programming or the big media will not touch. Yeah. So you're looking for this sort of program as a listener, or as somebody who's enjoying and being entertained by things. You're looking for subjects that you can't find anywhere else, and you'll find them in podcast. But my worry is that the industrialization of it, to a degree, might push that aside in a sense and make it more big media based and multimedia, and it loses that almost authenticity, that sort of level of show that people are looking for, and they'll suddenly not have that show and they won't be catered for.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's because, I'm sort of speculating here, but people are so much more aware and preoccupied with the size of their audiences now. How many downloads you're getting, and I think that can lead you to searching for something that's different to the kind of niche discussion that you're talking about. If you think, okay, there's I don't know anyone who's interested in this particular topic, let's do a podcast on it, put it out in the world, and there's got to be 100 people all around the world who are interested in it. But I think, when you see, such and such a podcaster gets million downloads every episode, it's sort of like you feel like, Are we really doing this right or reaching the audience? And definitely there's a big swell in people who I work with who are looking for sponsors.
Yeah.
And I think it's very difficult, and it's also very difficult to advise people on how realistic it might be to get a sponsor. And if you do, that completely changes the driver behind the podcast itself. I think that's it, really. Everywhere we're seeing the big numbers of a successful social media account or whatever. So it's probably a good sort of rallying cry to, don't be afraid about staying small and niche, because that is your superpower.
Yeah. If anybody out there wants to do an independent podcast about, I don't know, all these subjects that we've mentioned the tentacles, we mentioned attrition, we mentioned all these people. If somebody wants to do a deep dive on any of these different acts in a big way, you won't get an enormous millions of people listening to it, but you will get that audience that are interested in hearing that show across the world. You'll have those 1,000 listeners or whatever for that show, but you won't get the big millions or 1,000 in one country. Maybe, I don't know. But
yeah, exactly. Never say never, but it's unlikely. But yeah, I definitely, with cassette culture, I've just found it so exciting having people just get in touch, because it's resonated with them. And some of the people who I'm emailing with have got such a depth of knowledge about this sort of area of experimental music, underground music, and who are the significant players who did what. It's exciting to just suddenly meet these people out of the blue and have exchanges with them.
yeah. Oh, and when you suddenly get people from the past not spoken to for years suddenly contact you and say, "Oh, do you remember?" or whatever, and not even a "do you remember," you just bump into them,
Yeah,
and you suddenly
I,
find yourselves talking with them as though no time's passed at all.
yeah.
It's strange.
I feel like in most cases that person is me. I'm the one, I'm the one who sort of tracked down characters from my past and said, "Hey, I'm doing this podcast. Let's talk about what we did." But definitely, some people have. One of the things that I've realized, I used to think that my memory was pretty good,
Yeah.
but I've realized through doing this, my memory is not at all good, and I've been reminded of so many things that I had really sketchy memories of. It's been really interesting to find that, people's journeys and what they've done since, and share things recollections that we had from our original connections in the late 80s. But yeah, it's like the network is still there. You just got to put yourself in its way to be discovered. Whatever it is, whatever your interest is.
So the show format I like as well, because it's got an overall arc to the show, but at the same time, each individual episode has its own specific topic or subject that you are targeting for each episode. You've got to target this episode's about this, but each episode together makes a whole, all of the episodes together.
I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because that's the way I think about it. And I've just, I guess I'm hoping that it comes across like that, because what I found in the end, I didn't want to do an interview-based podcast. I wanted something that would actually have more music and sound design in there. So it was a bit more of a sort of experience of what's being discussed. But then I found each episode I did, people would mention other people, and it eventually sort of led me along to, I better go and talk to that other person and get their end of the story. So you sort of have, I think of it like a play or like a story, where you have these characters popping in, and those characters mention somebody else, and then a few episodes later they show up and you get their story. So you're sort of seeing the environment and the activities from these different angles, and hopefully have a memory of, oh yeah, somebody mentioned Gary Livermore a couple of
Yeah.
episodes ago, and now here
Yeah.
he is talking about what he did. That's my sort of thought about it, is to try to move the episodes along like it's exploring the network itself. So we're moving from one person to the other and talking a little bit about their history, but also what connections they had, and then using that to establish the continuity of the story.
Yeah, but that's an interesting one as well. Is that you'll listen to the show, and then you'll hear acts from different regions
Mm.
suddenly mention someone from an episode a few episodes ago, and you'll suddenly think, how has that person from this region been able to have anything to do with this person from up there? Or
Mm.
and it's sort of like, it's
I
going to
think
be a
that's
terrible pun. It's like they've got tentacles all over the place.
that's where the fanzine came into it. So people would get these fanzines, and then, as some of our guests have talked about, they literally go through the fanzine and go through the reviews, or the people would sometimes do calls for submissions and just say, we're doing a compilation on this theme, send your tapes to, here's that address. And people would go through and say, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll write to them, I'll send them some of my stuff. And yeah, it was organic how you sort of had a local network of people who did know each other, but then it would sort of jump, and suddenly you'd be in touch with a whole other little subset of people who knew people from their local scene. It's what you did with the gigs, right? It's just
Yeah, yeah.
sort of amplifying your local network. So suddenly it's a regional network, or a national network, or European network, whatever.
And it's to go big as well, because a lot of the cases I had it with the gig guide, for instance,
Yeah.
that a major magazine company would get hold of these things sometimes.
Oh yeah.
These were the great bits where you'd see. I remember the gig guide that I did got in the hands of. I always sent it to all the magazines as well, the nationals or
Hmm.
whatever, all the ones that were going out,
Oh yeah.
like the Kerangs and
Yeah.
things like that. And I just thought,
Yeah.
they're not going to do anything with it, or you think they're not.
Mm.
And then the amazing moment is when suddenly I've got my own copy of Kerrang, and I'm looking through it and I'm thinking, hold on a minute, how do they know these gigs that are happening in my area?
Oh yeah.
And then they'll attribute it or something. They'll go provided by dates, or they'll thank people or whatever. And you find it with some of these fanzines where these magazines get hold of the fanzines and they'll clip bits out of the fanzines, but
Yeah.
they will attribute it and they'll say, oh, this is from blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And those
Yeah.
were great when suddenly a bigger magazine would sort of like use
So
stuff from you that you've
yeah. Yeah.
published on a photocopier or a printer or something that you've
Yeah.
got. And it's
Yeah.
like, wow.
Well, it's a gift for the big publishers, isn't it? Because it's suddenly there's a whole piece of research and journalism done for them. So yeah, oh, that's a great story.
Which led to one of my favourite stories from myself was that one of our gigs that we did, we played somewhere in Mansfield.
Hmm.
And before we started, the original bass player of Sham 69 became a talent scout,
Oh yeah.
and he came to come and watch the gig because he saw it advertised through this means, through being in a big magazine, because I'd sent the gig list out. So he came to check this out. We didn't get anywhere, but the fact that I was able to chat, we were able to chat for half an hour or so with this guy and just have a really good conversation, wouldn't
Yeah.
have existed without that.
That's right. You've sort of drawn things to you through that network. When you tell the story, it sounds easy, but actually, there's all that underlying work of building your listings and distributing your listings. But then when you do, you're open to being seen, and suddenly
Yeah.
opportunity can come to you through that. Good use of the network.
Yeah, because I know people who worked on fanzines and these magazines that were
Hmm.
self published,
Mm.
who were seen by magazine companies, big magazine companies,
Mm.
and they ended up working in the industry because of this work that they got. A lot of that happened.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think it was that sort of proving ground where people could start their own magazine and then gather their interviews and sort of demonstrate what they could do. Yeah, definitely. I think in the case of Richard from Freakbeat, he ended up
Yeah,
doing bits of freelance journalism after he finished with Freakbeat, and he still may do things. But yeah, it's not uncommon for, particularly in that music world, suddenly you can write something for Record Collector or
yeah,
do a piece in whatever Mojo or one of those kind of magazines.
absolutely. How do you decide what subjects you're going to tackle with each episode and then the guests that you chat with as well? Do you pick guests specifically for those subjects, or is it you've had the chats with people and then base the subject around that?
It's a bit of a mixture. I think sometimes people will sort of volunteer contacts that, oh, they say, oh, you should talk to this other person. In a couple of cases, like with Richo Johnson, who runs Fourth Dimension Records, he just popped up through our website and got in touch and said, you might be interested in what I'm doing. And I think at the time I possibly didn't quite understand how he fitted into the picture. But then I did an interview with someone else and they mentioned him. And I was like, oh, he's the guy who I was trying to get hold of. Gary Levermore, who did Third Mind tapes for a long time, and he was quite elusive. And then I realized, oh, he knows Richo Johnson, and when they were teenagers, they sort of lived in Herne Bay and started their fanzines together and so on. So, sometimes, because a lot of this is, well, all of the topics that I'm covering in cassette culture, it's all pre-internet. So
Yeah,
you don't always have an email address or a website just to easily fire off a contact to. So some people have needed a little bit more digging and research to get hold of them. I spend a bit of time looking around on Discogs website, trying to find sort of leads. And I did locate a couple of people who were on that original compilation cassette that sort of started my podcast. It's hard to explain, but I just found them by just like looking up who's got what releases in their collection and whether they've made a particular comment that sounded interesting. So I found Rob Maycock, who back in the day did mind scan tapes,
yeah,
and just found his profile on Discogs and sent him a message through that website and said, you wouldn't know anything about this mind scan tapes. And he's, yes, I'm the man. And then in one case, I found somebody through a filing on Company's House because they'd put their details, because they ran a business that was registered through Company's House and had to submit records to it. So I managed to find their name and did a little bit of detective work around that, and eventually found one of their kids on Instagram and messaged them. And then month later, I got an email back from the person I was looking for. So yeah, sometimes it's a mixture of kind of people who are in my sites already, or who I'm already talking to, or even in some cases, people just mention other people. So in the podcast episode that I did with Rob Maycock of Mindscan, he mentioned a fanzine called Vital, which ran for quite a long period. It was a real sort of listings type of fanzine. And just him saying that, I thought, yeah, I remember Vital, and I know who created it. It's Frans de Waard. He lives in Holland. But that would make a great story of how did the fanzines, how were they made and how were they distributed and what part did they play in it. So that kind of kicked us off into covering fanzines in a little bit more detail. And yeah, the same. Frans is like an absolute font of information. So he mentioned a few other things, and I'll be covering them in the future too. But it's quite organic in my case. I'm not looking at someone who has done something that's completely sort of outside of our main topic. It's more, I think I'm always mindful of, I want it to make sense. So
Yeah.
rather than it just being a completely disconnected, I want it to have some sort of continuity with the world as we've been explaining it so far. Yeah.
I mean, I still mess about with cassette tape for recording purposes as well, and
Do you?
yeah,
Yeah.
we there's a group on Facebook called Four Track Recording
Oh yeah.
Collection. We're always
Mm.
in touch with each other, and we post up music that we record ourselves at home on Four Track, and it'll be posted up.
Yeah.
We'll discuss about it, and there's a large group of us who have this thing in place where we will record on one track one part, one instrument part or something, or a
Hmm.
vocal or something, and then we put it through the post, still use it, the mail system, and we'll
Magic.
send it
Yeah.
anywhere around the world to
Yeah.
someone somewhere else in the world or in the country or wherever. And then they will add a part as well. And then eventually, when
Mm.
all four tracks are filled, that's the song finished and it gets posted up. So that's something that's come into being quite recently as well. There's that sort of group that stems from all this interest in the culture in a sense.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I think that principle, the advent of the four track recorder definitely sort of enabled that idea to come about even back in the 80s, but it would have been so much more time consuming to find the people who you're going to collaborate with and yeah, then mail them stuff and then get it back and do something with it. But yeah, I think Martin Bowes from Attrition talked about doing something like that with a group in the USA
Yeah,
called Audio Letter, and they did like a split tape where they mutually added tracks to some initial recordings, and I think they did a complete share, so they both released their own versions of it with mixes that they'd done independently as well. So yeah, they got a lot of value out of the collaboration. But yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, the Porter studio itself is mentioned so regularly.
yeah.
It's such a sort of significant piece of technology of that era, because suddenly bedroom musicians had all this kind of recording power just right there in that one box, and it's mentioned in people who are doing the experimental stuff talking about it, and then in the Delirium episode, he's talking about Porcupine Tree and Bevis Frond recording on the Porter Studio. So it sort of had this kind of impact, no matter what music people were into. You could be a band, you could be doing something a bit more abstract, but yeah, it's definitely it sort of feels like it should be a podcast in itself about how it was designed and how did it evolve and so on. Such a powerful bit of gear. Yeah.
Even artists such as the early Jean-Michel Jarre work,
Yeah.
that was done with cassette
Oh yeah.
there. And I mean, I was fascinated with an interview with him. Somebody did a show, a podcast series, Limited, where they were
Mm.
talking with him. I think it was Mark Berry or Matt Berry that was talking with him. That was it. And Jean-Michel Jarre was saying that if you listen to Oxygen and Equinox
Hmm.
and that sort of early period of his and Magnetic Fields as well, he was saying that that music was all based around, he could hear the a rhythm in the actual sound of the tape cassette as he's recording, which is why
Okay.
all of those records from then have got that sort of same sort of feel that's
Okay. Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
It's because it's all done to the timing of the tape cassette that he can hear while he's recording. And that's
Oh,
something else
okay.
that you don't get with any other form of recording. You can't get it because you don't have that innate warmth and that rhythm of the sound of the tape cassette, the beats that you can hear in the
Yeah.
background and the noises that you get.
I like that idea of having these being influenced by these moving machines that are in your space, you would perceive the time of that rotation. Yeah, nice.
So we're sourcing the media then, and then using the music. Is it all from your own collection, or have you sourced it from found things?
Yeah, no, it's highly sourced from various, because some of the stuff which I play, the little kind of music snippets, it's again it's never been mass released or anything, so it only existed in limited runs on cassettes,
Yeah.
which are now to one degree or another quite hard to find. So sometimes I've got a big want list on Discogs of some of this stuff, but it doesn't often come up for sale. But there are a couple of really great websites that have preserved music from that sort of cassette era, and you can download an MP3 and a scan of the cover of it. So sometimes I'm getting it through that way. I've sort of tried to use as much as possible like alternate versions of things. So if I want to air something from, say, like in one episode we played some Cabaret Voltaire because they were significant to the topic there, which is now owned by Mute Records and Played Again Sam, or they control the publishing of it. And I put some stuff out on YouTube. We've got some other sort of, the podcast is on YouTube, but there's also some additional content on YouTube. And mostly if you publish music, it's an option that the claimant has. How do they want to manage that? They usually take the view of, if you monetize your video through advertising, then they will have that, and that can be your kind of payment for use of their copyrighted material. But in the case of Mute and Play It Against Them, they will just like blanket ban this video will now be banned in 178 countries for using that 30 seconds of music. So I had to redo my piece to not include it. Otherwise, I don't know where it could be available in the world, but most countries it was blocked, which seemed a little bit of a productive approach to me. But yeah, so that's the case. But in general podcast land, it's not quite so policed if you do use any copyright stuff. I mean, it's a difficult decision to make because the artists deserve compensation for their work, but in most of the cases for my podcast, it's unknown music which I'm digging up either by buying cassettes or finding some way of getting a copy of it. Yeah. And actually, through doing that, I found some incredible fan websites out there. There's a really great Hawkwind one. We were talking about Hawkwind earlier on. There's someone who's got a website that basically has recordings of almost every gig they've ever done is there and available. It's a huge archive. So when I did an episode and we talked about this 1983 UK Electronica Festival, I actually found recordings of the incarnation of Hawkwind that played there, and so I could actually use the very music in the show.
Cool.
Yeah,
That's cool. Yeah, it's difficult that with the Mute Records, because I mean, of course, Daniel Miller and everybody else from Mute Records started with this. That stemmed from the small in the back bedroom of his house in the back in the day, and it's led to that. I mean, you'd probably have the same problem with the Porcupine Tree stuff, because that now those old recordings, they're all now licensed because Stephen Wilson has actually officially issued them on. He did a series, didn't he? He did the Delirium years or something. That is all those recordings technically. So
yeah, okay.
yeah,
So it's all sort of like whatever, owned by Universal or some company with a lot
it is part of UMG, I
muscle.
think. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah, okay. Yeah, that's the case. And I think it becomes a little bit distanced from the artist themselves. It's just one arm of the commercial music industry whose job it is to collect money and payments from all sorts of broadcast uses. If those do trickle back to the artist, then it probably makes his month when he gets a royalty check for that. But yeah, in terms of the independent podcasting world, I think you just need to navigate it a little bit carefully.
Yeah, that's one bit I don't like about the podcasting world is this thing of we could make much more interesting shows for people if there wasn't this licensing issue in a way where we could do these shows that would be more interesting to people because you'd have these clips from music you'd be discussing without the overhanging. Oh, are they going to catch us? Are we going to get into trouble for this? And if they lost
Yeah.
that, it's weird because you're promoting their product in a sense that gets interest to their product, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think there's lots of ways to look at it, and I think it probably will become a bit more formalized probably quite soon. I would think. I mean, YouTube have had their content ID system for a very long time now, so I think it I'm not sure if it will be an entirely happy day if that kind of suddenly is present in Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and your episodes are sort of flagged and potentially not distributed because of copyright music use. But I think it's inevitable that some sort of formality will be brought to bear on it. So I think until then, we just try and either be creative with what we're doing or stay under the radar and get away with it while you can.
So how do you record and edit the episodes?
Yeah, so a lot of the people that almost entirely the people that I talk to are in other countries other than the one I'm in. So I use Squadcast to do the remote interviews with them. So that gives me a way to record hopefully higher quality audio capture of them and then download the file afterwards. Usually works really well. People still occasionally have a little bit of a technical problem connecting to it, but that's my sort of first call platform for recording the online chats.
Yep.
And then I edit in Wavelab, in Steinberg Wavelab. It lets me do everything I need to do as far as editing goes. And I think I've been using a DAW software for a long time. And from the Atari computer, I was using Steinberg's Cubase software.
Yeah,
and
same.
I think there's something about the tape metaphors that they have built into their software that suddenly I just sort of got it more. So I know a lot of people use Pro Tools, or I mean they've all got tape sort of analogies in the way they work, I guess. But yeah, I think I've tuned into the Steinberg sort of way of doing things. So Wavelab is a great tool for me. So I'll edit in Wavelab, and then I've got some outboard gear here that I'll run it through when I do the masters, just to sort of sweeten the sound a little bit. But that's my usual workflow. And then either there's a lot of sound design elements in what I do as well. So I might try and, if it's about a location, sometimes I like to have a field recording of a location. So when we did the episode about Third Mind Records, it starts off talking about Herne Bay in Kent, which is where they were from. So I found a recording someone had put online from the beach at Herne Bay, and I just dropped them an email and said, "Oh, do you mind if I use this in my podcast?" And so I might bring in a few location recordings like that. And obviously we've got lots of effects and sort of tape rewind effects and that kind of stuff in the podcast that I kind of just work on myself here and then spin them in. Yeah. So yeah, that's my usual workflow. I think that's all there is to it, really. But some of the edits that I do, particularly where there's multiple voices and lots of editing, it is a bit of a mammoth job sometimes putting them all together. So in the case of that one, the Third Mind episode, I did 2 kind of 1 hour interviews with my 2 principals, which I then sort of edited the sort of story that I wanted to keep, and then assembled them so that they made sense in tandem and sort of tracked along. And then they both mentioned other people, so I wanted to have some different reflections in there. So I had to get in touch with Dave Henderson, the sounds journalist that they talked about, and got a little quote from him and flew that in. And in that case, I wasn't too worried about what it sounded like. So I just said, look, just record it on your computer, however you can. I don't mind, or record it into your phone. It doesn't matter. And so he just did it some way or other and sent it to me. But yeah, that's the usual approach I take to them so far.
It sounds like a show that is long gestating. It that needs a lot of work involved to
Yeah.
put together.
Yeah, sometimes so I might do those kind of narrative edits where I'll find out what are the big points that come up in the interviews that I want to present, and sometimes it means tough choices. Like you might have a really nice anecdote, but it's just doesn't fit, or it's just too much of a tangent that's not going to help our storyline. So I have to throw away things quite regularly. But I'll do the narrative edit, which would just be the voice, and I sort of leave gaps in it. So if I'm sort of thinking, there needs to be either a bit of a space there to let people think about what's been said, or let's bring in some music which is relevant to what's being discussed. So I'll then do the music stage as like a separate session. So I do a lot of listening in between times. So I might just play out the interview bits and just edit it, and then listen to it during the week, and then next weekend sort of come back to it and go, okay, well, now I can do the fun bit. I'm happy with the narrative. Now I'm going to add the music in there, and that leads me down a bit of a rabbit hole sometimes of finding the music for one time, or some things I buy the albums, or just try and wait till someone's selling it on Discogs so I can get hold of it. But yeah, you're right. It is done in a few stages, and then by the time I've got the final mix, I'll listen to that for a little bit, and then maybe make a few more adjustments, sort of tighten things up, or in some cases change the music choices. But yeah, I feel like I work quite quickly, but actually it does take a long time. I think it's one of those things, no matter which way you dice it, it takes a while to do it. So yeah, but it is something that I do for the love of it. So I'm happy to be kind of spending my time doing that stuff anyway.
But after so many interviews with people, I'm guessing that you would suddenly realize certain areas where there's a similarity between people, and then you'll think, right, so I'm going to have to get this bit from this person, that from that person, and that from this person, etc. And that will then work with the narrative. But those anecdotes that you're talking about, eventually they might come into being used at another point, because you never know down the line. You might come across something when you're doing a show, and you'll think, hold on a minute, I spoke with them 2 years ago, and I'm pretty sure that they mentioned something about this that I didn't use that I really enjoyed. So you might come to use those clips at another point.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on there, Martin. One of the examples of that I've got is when we talked to Franz de Waard, about his Vital fanzine, he told a story about going to the USA in the early 90s. And he was at somebody's house and they said, I'm going to go and check my email. And you can imagine at that time, that was an uncommon thing to do. And he was like, what's this? He's checking his what? And suddenly got introduced to this thing, email, and then came back and started implementing a sort of a web presence for the label he was working for. Mm-hmm. And then probably 2 or 3 interviews later, I was talking to Daniel Plunkett, who was the publisher of he's from Austin, Texas, and he published a fanzine called ND. Back in those days, it was a really significant magazine with lots of interviews, but loads of listings and micro reviews in it. So it was a real hub of information. And kind of unprovoked, he brought up, he had a little gig network over there. He would book some artists for a gig, and then he knew someone somewhere else in the US, and they would have a mini tour circuit. And so he said, when Franz de Waard came over here with his project, he came and stayed with us, and we put him on. And I was like, when he stayed with you, did you check your email while he was there? And he's like, yeah, probably. And I realized across the span of these couple of episodes, like Franz had already mentioned it, and then suddenly here's the guy who was the guy who he saw
checked
checking
his email. Yeah.
So it seems like a really kind of like nerdy little thing, but culturally, yeah, that was just about the introduction of the internet that obviously changed everybody's life. So I felt like it was worth picking out. So I found that quote from the interview I did with Franz, and then sort of flew it into the episode I did with Dan, just to give that other voice. So suddenly you have the story. Oh, when Franz came and stayed with us, and then here's Franz talking about discovering email. But yeah, there's definitely those sort of cases, and sometimes I have a situation where I might have a few interviews that are in the can, and I know I'm going to use them, but I haven't quite got to the actual episode yet. So this is one of the uses I've found for kind of AI type of technology, where I put my raw interviews into a platform called Otter, which is it started off as a transcription platform, but now they've introduced these sort of AI features to it. So you can ask it, find this, or find mentions of this person or this release. So what I've done is I've grouped my interviews into a channel in Otter. So that means the AI can cross-reference things. So I can now say, find all the references to the Tascam Porter Studio in these interviews, and it will come up and give me sort of names and the little quotes and time codes of things. So that's been a kind of really time-saving pre-production tool to sort of pick out things that might have a little bit of continuity between different interviews, because otherwise I think it'd be really hard to hold that all in your mind, even to know that those things are there. And you couldn't necessarily get that with just a paper transcription, because you just wouldn't be able to contain it all. So yeah, that's been an interesting kind of journey. I've never really sort of resonated with AI. You hear so much about it, and probably every other podcast I'm producing for clients at the moment, people are talking about AI and so on. I've always sort of felt a bit skeptical about it, particularly from the copyright view and the unreliable nature of some of the facts that are quoted by AI. But discovering it and how to use it in the transcription tool, suddenly I'm like, yes, I see it now, how useful it's going to be.
Depends upon its use as to what you're using it for. AI,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So I love the show images, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a bit of a sort of Sunday afternoon fun for me of evolving those. I just sort of felt because the Cassette Culture podcast is a lot of fun for me to do. I just thought, yeah, I'm going to use all the features available. So not many people in my experience can sort of keep up their production flow enough to do things like episode images, and I think the benefit of them is not always clear to people.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just thought I've got a sort of evolved a bit of a template look for the episode images, and then because they get pulled through onto the website, suddenly there's like a sort of post image for each of the episodes too, and that's semi automated. So once I've gone to the effort of making the image, then it can be visible in the podcast apps, but then it's also has a good use on the website too. But yeah.
But the images match what each individual episode is about. It's almost like you're creating your own album cover art for each episode.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I try to. I mean, this is another thing, isn't it? Where I think I may even have done this. Oh, in fact, I did. I think for one episode, just go into Gemini or one of those image generation tools and just say, "Give me an image of a cassette with this in the background," and then I just thought, yeah, this is all looking a little bit anonymous. It and sort of generic. It looks much like the other AI generated images that you see. So now I do try and, I mean, it's just because of the topic of the cassette culture. But if we're talking about a fanzine, I'll find a scan of that fanzine, and that can be part of the design. And in some cases, the bands or the labels will have logos that for the labels. That makes things a bit more easy to grab sources for. So yeah, I think I find it quite easy to do them now, but it's been a bit of an organic process of just finding a style for them, and honestly put a whole lot of thought into that. I just thought I'll just create something, and then when I walk away happy with it, then that's what it will be. There have been a couple that I've spent probably a bit too much time sort of noodling away on, but some of them have happened quite quickly. But that's the benefit of years messing around in Photoshop that suddenly lets me do that.
There's some beautiful collages that you've got in the show art, for sure. So we've already we've gone into a lot of standout moments in the show already. So what advice would you give to people who want to start their own podcast?
I feel like when we talked early on about the DIY spirit being the roots of podcasting, I think that's really something to hold on to in that we've got this unique opportunity just to sort of examine specifics of stuff that we're interested in as humans, whatever that is, and it can be free of thoughts about commercialism. And obviously there's a bit of effort and work involved in the production side of podcasts, but you can get better at doing that. It just needs practice, like anything. So I don't think anyone should be put off because they don't have expensive software or they're unfamiliar with that process, because you can learn that. But what is harder to have is the idea and motivation in the first place. So that's like the most valuable thing you can have, and then everything else you can finesse that as you go along. So I definitely feel like if people don't be worried, that what I hear quite a lot from people is, oh, but there's so many podcasts out there. Yeah, there are, but there's also loads of TV shows and magazines, and there's loads of everything. So don't let that sort of put you off, because what we're doing is we're in control of it. So it doesn't have to happen in a short period of time. If it's something that you have an interest for, you can just sort of keep plugging away. And honestly, it will take a long time for you to reach your audience, but every step you take is growth with podcasting, because it's structured around gathering followers. So your goal when you publish is, as we commonly hear, and subscribe. Don't worry about liking so much. Get them to subscribe, get them to follow, so that you're building. And then the next episode you do, you get more followers, and then if everything comes together and you keep at it long enough, you have an audience that make it worthwhile to publish your content. And I mean, I even have some shows, I'm getting into that idea of, you got to have a big audience, I guess, but I have some shows who they definitely don't want a big audience, because they're targeted on a very specific type of people, which there may not be millions of. So they're looking at quality listeners. And for them, in fact, for a lot of my people who get a little bit dismayed, I haven't hit 1,000 downloads yet or something. I'm kind of like, look, you've had 50 downloads. Imagine if all of those people were in the same room as you. How cool would that be? That would be a big crowd suddenly, from feeling like, it's not a big crowd. So it's that the sort of context. But yeah, it's being open to opportunity. So I think if you put out into the world what you've got to say, you honestly, you never know what will come back. And that's definitely my experience with cassette culture. I didn't really start with any audience ambitions. I hadn't done, you hear people talking about, you've got to do a market analysis and find gaps in the market and all that sort of thing. I honestly I would say, why are you going to do that? Because let's say you do find a gap in the market, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll have anything of value to contribute to that gap in the market. Just do what you have a passion for. And if you get all those sort of bases covered, then you'll find that you'll get a response from it. What I've found is, in terms of sort of covering the publishing bases, I decided to have a website for the podcast, partly to answer that question of, when you publish, you've got to kind of list all of these available. Click here for Spotify, click here for Apple, click here for everything else. I thought, it's messy, and it's whatever link you list, for some people that won't be relevant. So I thought, actually, if I have a website, that's my goal. Get people to the website, and then from there, they can go wherever all the players are listed. But through doing that, what I found, and it might be particularly because of the topic in my podcast, I found that there's probably, I don't know, at least a third of my audience for my podcast are people who don't listen to podcasts. Either because they're not, I don't know, they don't like to listen to things on their phones, or they don't want to use an app, or they don't want to do anything new or whatever. But what they will do is they'll click through and they'll listen to an embedded audio player on the website, which honestly is a little bit frustrating, because I can't capture them as followers there. They just come, listen to the podcast, and then they go. But looking at my statistics, there's a meaningful number of those people, and they might come back. So that I think that's been a worthwhile step. You've got your free distribution, where you can reach significant numbers on Apple and Spotify, but there's a kind of too unknown group of people who like the podcast, but they don't listen to it on a podcast app. Of course, the relatively new presence is YouTube in the podcasting space. So I piped the podcast into YouTube to see what happens. Yeah. And it's been quite good as well in terms of the commenting and the liking culture on YouTube. Sort of feels quite good, and it's quite good for motivation. Finally, you see, oh, I've had 30 plays of this podcast, and I was sort of seeing it as like an extra bonus play. I'm like, I'm not a YouTuber. I'll put the podcast on YouTube and see what happens. The listens are generally shorter on YouTube, so it might just be either people are testing it out, or it might just be the behavior of people on YouTube. They listen for bits of things rather than a whole half an hour, 20-minute episode. But it's given me the thought about using chapters more with that sort of audience retention ambition. I want to have people listen for longer. So if people are bailing out on an episode at 2 minutes in, this was my thought of, what if I use the chapter markers, put chapter markers in so people can easily jump to other sections, and it's sort of more visible so they know what's coming later. And if they're not getting what they want at 2 minutes, maybe they'll sort of jump forward to 10 minutes in and keep listening. And you get really good data in the dashboard on YouTube. So I've definitely seen that feature is used, and it has helped grow audience retention number. And then, of course, once I started doing it, I thought, oh, you can do chapter markers in audio podcast too. I should do that. Yeah. It is another piece of work. It never ends, but I'd already done it for YouTube. So I thought I'd just copy and paste those. I'm not aware of being able to get any data on how those are used in audio, because although there is a lot of data, it's not that great, I feel, and I've not been able to visualize that through Apple or Spotify or anywhere else, how the chapter markers are used. But they're pretty easy to do, so it seems like it could help with audience retention on those platforms too. So anyway, so there's a whole lot of hopefully some of those things I've mentioned there are useful for people at one end or other of the podcasting journey.
Yeah. Chaptering only takes me about 10 minutes to do on my episodes. Yeah. It doesn't take very long, but it's interesting because...
I think how do you approach thinking of what is worth making into a chapter, Leo? How do you think about segmenting things?
Me and you use something very use the same thing. I've got Otter in the background, running in the background, and that will make suggestions to me about chaptering.
All right,
that is part of it, which is just it's a lifesaver. It's a time saver in a lot of ways.
No, that's really interesting. I didn't even think about using Otter for that, which I will now do. In fact, I'll probably claim I thought about it. I thought of the idea to somebody next week.
but yeah, so I will listen back to the episode with those chapters suggested by Otter, and I will think, right, does that work? Will cutting into there or skipping forward to there, is that really that different to what was there before? So I'll still make strategic decisions as to whether I think the chaptering is completely right to do it that way, or if that splits up the conversation too much.
Yeah,
as well.
I think that's the sort of the best way to think about a lot of these AI tips is you don't just take them straight from the machine. You've got to apply a bit of a human sensibility to them as well, and go, it's a kickstart to this task. But let me then review that and adjust it as I to what I want. But that's an interesting thought.
Yeah. I always use it as an advisory, or most of the time with
Yeah,
AI, I will use it as an advisor as opposed to
yeah,
an all out, this is how it's going to be done. I will always double check.
yeah, yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
What shows do you like to listen to yourself?
I honestly have such a scarcity of extra listening time. There's those two. One show I mentioned previously, the 2600 show, a bunch of New Yorkers kind of sitting around gassing about sort of techie nerd topics. There's another show that I loved listening to, which I made a little note of it. It was called the Independent Music Podcast. And it was two guys just talking about music and playing usually fairly obscure tracks, a lot of new things and things that the audience has suggested to them. And comment here on podcasting generally. And that was like became one of my regulars. I'd listen to that. It came out every week. I'm there. I know there's a new episode every Tuesday. And then it just stopped. Yeah. We got to Christmas and then they were gone. And I felt like I'd been ghosted. Suddenly, my podcast friends who would share their new music picks with me, they weren't there anymore. And I couldn't do anything about it. So I often tell people that I work with about, if you're going to decide to finish your season, say that. Talk to the listener like they're a real person who's listening to you. Just we're taking a little break for a while, but we'll be back or we won't be back or whatever it is. But tell the listener so you avoid those. It wouldn't stop me if they started publishing again. It wouldn't stop me from listening, but it's sort of left me in a strange space. And to me, that was a real illustration of what we get, I think, from podcasting, that authenticity. And you're sitting hearing these guys talk and they're friendly and they're funny and it's enjoyable and you connect with it in a completely different way to the way you do with a TV show or radio show or something. I felt like I wasn't part of it, but I was invested in them continuing. Yeah, so I don't listen to that anymore because it's not being broadcast, but that was one of my favorites. The only other things I listen to regularly are kind of music. I listen to one which I've listened to for years called Low Light Mixes, which is sort of relaxing, ambient, kind of sleep time music. So I like that for the sort of functionality of it. It serves a particular purpose. If I want to have some quiet, contemplative music, I'll go to that. The other one that I listen to for like sort of music discovery is called Headphone Commute. And it's always new artists or spotlights on particular artists or guest mixes and that type of stuff. So personally, those are my picks.
Right, this is me looking for Headphone Commute.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Got it.
Yeah, it's been going for a long time. I feel like I should know who publishes it, but I don't.
I've got that on my phone waiting for me to have a look at.
Yeah. It's usually very sort of tastefully done kind of contemporary music show.
Okay, so where can people find you and get hold of you then, Martin?
This is where we win with the website, cassetteculturepodcast.com. That tells you everything. You can find links to everywhere else. And yeah, see a few of the YouTube videos while you're there too.
Yep. Right. Thank you very much for speaking with me today, Martin.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
It has been a lot of fun. Yep. Same again. If you want to get in touch with pods like us, just go to themarvzone.org and all of your links are there, including Patreon and all those other things. But until next time, thank you everyone for listening and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.